Okay, so welcome to the NERI discussion series. This week we've got Dr. Nuala Whelan and Dr. Michael McGann from Maynooth University to discuss their work on active labour market policies. So just for a bit of context, I'm of the age where I remember quite vividly the strategies and approaches of the government in 2011, before 2011 and post 2011, in terms of job bridge and internship programs that kind of were not always used as what they were advertised as stepping stones on a career ladder. There were stories of displacement in takeaways and in being companies, I remember, and some employers using this scheme to subsidize already low paid work which they would have hired anyway, and of no or of little benefit to a lot of the young people who took these up. So we're looking into another period of high unemployment, very likely, like we did in 2008, perhaps even worse. Let's hope not. But the active labour market policies and the approaches of government will be back in focus in the coming years. And Nuala and Michael have written a couple of papers, and one in particular on the high road approach to recovery and how that might come into conflict, I suppose, with some of the strategies of the past. So we'll go to Nuala first. And Nuala, if you could tell us, have I got that stuff right there? And what's the what are the signs on the horizon? Are there lessons that have been learned from the approach in the high unemployment for couple of years there last year, and have we learned those lessons?
Okay, great. Thanks, Kieran. And thanks for that introduction. So myself and Michael have been working with Professor Mary Murphy at Maynooth University on two projects, really. I'll let Michael introduce his own project in a few minutes, but my project has been focused on a collaborative approach to building public employment services. So really from the outset, and it was designed pre-COVID, the focus was on leaving no one behind. So we were very clear that a lot of people had been left behind in the last recovery, and there were still, quite significant numbers of people who were out of the labour market, either long-term unemployed or who hadn't participated in the labour market in a long time. So we were very keen to look at the types of supports that, would enable people from those cohorts to get back to work, but back into decent work. So not just any old job will do type of work, but something more sustainable for the future. So I suppose the report that you there, Kieran, the High Road Back to Work report, tried to kind of think about what a high road would look like, and a road that would be inclusive of everyone to access decent and sustainable work. We also looked at the role of enabling employment guidance in that process. So what role does guidance have? Career guidance, but very much career guidance that focuses on employability and employment access. What does that look like as well? So I suppose at the moment, and really since March of last year, the unemployment rate has been kind of, first of all, there was kind of a sharp and fast unemployment, around the March 2020 time. And got kind of unemployment went from 5%. It was in or around 5% before the pandemic hit. And we saw rates of the COVID adjusted rates of unemployment going up to 28% last year. The current rate is about 22%, but youth unemployment, the COVID adjusted youth rate is 61%. So really quite, worrying figures. And excuse me, if people don't go back to, sorry, so to take some water. So presumably many of those people will go back to work once things start to properly open up. But for many people, that won't be their experience. So the support to date has been very passive support in terms of the pandemic unemployment payment, the wage subsidy schemes, and all of those kind of monetary supports that have been provided to people. But really, I think it's time now to start looking at what form the public employment services can take in terms of really helping everyone back to work. And people who are very distant from the labour market have a much further distance to travel back to work. So people who have maybe been in and out of work over the last year or so, maybe still have the confidence to return to work. And one of the things that I'm very interested in looking at is, the well-being impacts of unemployment. And we know from previous recessions or, just a lot of research that's taken place around unemployment that it really does have negative impact on our well-being and our mental health. So really helping people to take the risk and to build their confidence to return to work. And that's quite difficult to do when we know at the moment that there are these kind of, we've had closures and then openings and then closures and openings and so on. So this kind of yo-yoing effect, which is really very difficult. We know from ourselves, just even remote working, how psychologically demanding that has been, and even the uncertainty of the future and not knowing maybe whether your job is going to be still there in a few months, that uncertainty is kind of palpable, I think, at the minute. So for people who are in that period of unemployment, it's really, really important that the services that we develop and design are inclusive and enabling, and trying to target people who really need particular supports, individualizing those services. And that really requires, workers that are very skilled, public employment service workers who understand the experience of unemployment, who understand that people have to take a risk to get back into the world of work. So I have one slide that I might just share just in terms of how that might work. Okay. So you can hopefully see this. So this is from a paper that we published in the British Journal of Guidance and Counselling, but we also refer to it in the High Road report. And it tries to look at the different types of labour market policy choices that we have around, designing the services for people who are experiencing unemployment. And you can see across the top there's 4 different models that that have been well researched in the past and that we've tried to bring together into a continuum. So the work first activation model, which will be very familiar to everyone, I think, and it's really been the experience, the Irish experience for the last 10 years or so with Pathways to Work. So trying to very, quickly help people back into work. So keeping people close to the labour market and helping them get back to jobs as quickly as possible. So that work first model, I suppose, works very well if you have people who are close to the labour market, who have good skills, and if there are lots of jobs where you can help people access decent jobs. However, it's more difficult if you have less jobs and if people maybe don't have the skills to access the good jobs. So then it really, I suppose, focuses on helping people get back into any job. And it's often characterised by conditionality and sanctions that we've seen in the Pathways to Work model. So for people who are very distant from the labour market and who maybe don't have the good skills or the relevant skills that are required in the labour market at the minute, this can push them into jobs that maybe are short term, that aren't of great quality, that are low pay, and it keeps people in that cycle rather than helping them to develop sustainable careers and develop their skills and so on. Then the human capital model focuses more on training, upskilling, education, but again, very much focused on what is required within the labour market. So it still doesn't give people maybe the range of choice that they might like if they were, coming from a career guidance perspective, trying to think of the job that you would really like, where you're using your strengths every day, that you're getting, fulfillment and meaningful work and it's rewarding and so on. So the human capital model, while it helps people upskill and access better work, hopefully, and have careers, where they can transition in the world of work. Again, for people who are maybe have that further distance to travel, it mightn't offer the holistic support that they need in order to reduce the risk and build their confidence. The flourishing work-life balance model is the model that we've tried to, I suppose, we think is more practical, and also more holistic in terms of what it tries to do. So very much looking at a holistic perspective of the person. What are the challenges that they face every day when trying to access decent work, and how can we offer them the supports to enable that? So it does require a longer time, access to more education and training, or a wider variety of education and training, but also focusing in on things like care, in the home, childcare, or caring for adults, and also other issues like transport, just more practical issues. So trying to look at the person in a more holistic way, and helping them to, working with them to think about what their career or their working life might look like. And then the life first really is very much about kind of capability led, focused on well-being, and work might be one of the options that a person might choose, but the predominant focus isn't work. It's more about the life of the individual, and work may be a feature of that. So from a practical point of view, the human capital development work-life balance models would seem quite realistic in terms of a public employment service that's more inclusive. And we tried to, these terms down the side, other researchers have looked at these different models from these perspectives in terms of, how the individual is conceptualized within them, what the detail of those models might look like if they were being implemented. And what we've tried to do is look at the role of employment guidance within each of these different types of labour market policy models. So we've worked out there the type of employment guidance that each of those then might offer, and what type of employability it leads to. So you can see that the work first is very much about functional or market-led employability. Human capital is more about fostering employability with the individual. Work life is more about enabling employability, and the life first is more about empowering. So you can see the differences in the possible employability outcomes that each of those policy options might offer. So that's kind of the work that we've been doing, and my focus has been kind of on the psychological impact, and the need, I suppose, to raise the bar, raise the quality of what we can offer in Ireland. I think there are a lot of staff working in public employment services around the country, both in the public service and also in contracted services, that have the skills to offer these types of services to support people. So it's really about kind of, upping the game, I think, and thinking about this, a more quality-driven approach. So maybe I'll let Michael come in there. It might be an opportune time for him to come in.
Okay, thanks a million, Nuala. And Michael, just what we were discussing there about the approach post 2008 and what we're seeing on the horizon now with any kind of kite flying, and there's myself and Nuala discussed this last week, where it looked like about this time last year there might have been a paradigm shift. And that's kind of up in the air now whether there has been a paradigm shift. Maybe there has been internationally, but the Irish government at the moment seem, at least there are signs there that they're kind of less critical, I suppose, of the approach last time. So what are we seeing here? And have we learned the lessons of the financial crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. It's a great question.
I'll share a screen there.
I'll do that. I'll come on to that in a minute. I think the early last year was an interesting kind of watershed moment, and there was a kind of suspension of the kind of nexus between welfare and activation. actually wrote a paper in the Irish Journal of Sociology on the kind of political economy of welfare in a time of coronavirus, where we actually had this kind of disconnect between being on benefits and having to job search, and we saw the kind of value of the payments with the introduction of the pandemic unemployment payment really increased dramatically. So we or this disruption created by the COVID pandemic to the kind of political economy welfare, really, in the sense of having this connection in our system that developed after the last crisis between the receipt of payments and the kind of impetus to push people into the labour market, and that's been disrupted. But I think, as you're saying there, we are seeing now the seeds of a return much more towards the kind of old suite of strategies that we deployed in the last crisis. And I think it was really interesting in that to kind of separate out and cope with the pandemic crisis, they had to introduce this new administrative category of this pandemic unemployment payment that created this idea that this level of generous welfare payments, relatively generous in terms to kind of, in comparative terms to the baseline job seeking payment rates, was an exceptional state, was an unusual measure, whereas the kind of state that we'd been in for the last decade was the kind of way things are, the status quo, the normal. And I suppose that's the question of what we're returning to now, and whether, and that's the work that Mary, Nuala and I have been doing, whether the kind of reconfiguration of our activation policy settings that we embarked on after the last crisis is fit for purpose in the context of a post-COVID situation, and especially in the context that we're emphasizing of leaving no one behind. And I'll talk in a couple of moments about who the kind of policies that we implemented last time worked for and who they didn't work for, and the scale of the challenge that's actually kind of facing us as we come out of this COVID crisis sooner rather than later, we hope. So I might just share my screen now and walk through a couple of those. So as far as policies for the advertisement, that's just because I'm a Marie Curie research fellow in the Department of Sociology and the Social Sciences Institute at Maynooth University. So I have to make sure I flag that in my presentations. So I guess looking at the last decade of welfare reform, and we've actually, Nuala was part of this special journal issue as well, but Mary and I guest edited a special journal issue of administration that's just come out recently, which is kind of reflecting on the last 10 years of activation policy in Ireland. And we have a couple of papers in that where we talk about the twin tracks really of active labour market policy reform post-COVID, or sorry, not post-COVID, post the Great Recession. And what we mean by that is, alongside the kind of turn towards work first that Nuala's been talking about in her kind of typology or continuum of employment guidance approaches there's also been the introduction of important institutional and governance reforms and governance changes as well. And so the general consensus among people that work in this area is that pre-crisis, and I'm talking about the Great Recession here, we had effectively quite a passive system of welfare, where there was very little conditionality, there was very little compulsion to participate in active labour market programmes. Ireland's active labour programmes, insofar as they were quite human capital orientated, as Nuala was talking about there, particularly FOSS, the National Employment and Training Authority, obviously had an historical emphasis on this, as did the network of local employment services that grew up in the 90s in particular local labour market areas with very high levels of disadvantage, and focusing on those who are more distant from employment, and training and reskilling people was a real important focus of these active labour market policies. But because they were separated out from the system of income support, so it was kind of considered a very passive form of income support. And then in an early review of Ireland's activation policies at the last crisis, the OECD called for a coercive approach, and that's their term, where we would introduce much stronger job searching obligations. And that was kind of embedded then in the memorandum of understanding signed with the Troika, where we had reform of our activation policies and our activation institutions as a condition of the bailout. that we have to regularly report on. And then we've had the suite of pathways to work reforms since 2011, 2012, which have introduced new obligations for job seekers, which have seen cuts to payments, although they've been partially restored in recent years. And obviously, FOSS has now been disbanded, and we've had the introduction of the new intro model. And also in 2005, we've had the introduction of the marketization element, the contracting of the job path service, which is actually the predominant public employment service at the moment in the state in terms of expenditure, a number of sites, a number of staff that are servicing job seekers through this program. So that's targeted at those who are long-term unemployed, but it's very much a work-first model that's funded, delivered by two private agencies on the basis of a kind of payment by results funding approach. So what we've sort of seen in the last decade really is this turn towards work first, but you might also describe it, it's commonly described as job search services and sanctions. So for instance, in the period 2012 to 2017, there was a kind of an 11-fold increase in the number of claimants who had been penalty rated or sanctioned in Ireland, albeit coming off a very low baseline. And the level of sanctioning does remain quite low in Ireland, it has to be said, in kind of international comparative terms. But I also want to flag that alongside these kind of institutional restructures of our public employment and our active labour market policies, the overall level of expenditure on public employment services and employment supports in Ireland has remained very low and has declined quite considerably, in fact, since the last recession. So this is just from the OECD stat database on expenditure on public employment services. So these are, the top chart is public employment services of the intro job path that are about job placement services. So we see here that Ireland's expenditure on public employment services as a percentage of our GDP has declined from sort of 0.04% of GDP in 2006, 2007 pre-crisis levels to now it's about 0.01% of GDP. And that's well above the OECD average, which is this black line here, and even well below other kind of liberal welfare regimes like Australia or the UK, although we don't have recent data for the UK. Now we do have slightly better expenditure on the more kind of human capital development aspects, the training programs. So the bottom graph shows the kind of expenditure on training programs for the unemployed as a percentage of GDP, and we can see here that Ireland has gone from being well above the OECD average pre-crisis, where we were spending, upwards of almost 0.4% of GDP on training programs, to now we're spending just about along the lines of the OECD average, which is 11.12% of GDP on training programs. So this is signaling a move away from human capital development towards a work-first oriented approach. And we can see we're well below the level that Denmark, which is often held up as a kind of model country in terms of active labour market policy initiatives, they're spending around about 0.4% of GDP on training programs, and that's a much more human capital orientated model of activation than what we're seeing here in Ireland. But what I'm interested in, what I'm studying, I'm leading a project on the governance of activation in Ireland. That's part of my Marie Curie fellowship, is the intersection between these two reform tracks, the intersection between this kind of substantive policy turn towards job search services and sanctions, but also how the government's reforms that have been implemented, such as, and in particular, the contracting out of service delivery to kind of private organizations and market-based providers through kind of marketized payment by results funding models, can kind of reinforce and intensify that work-first reorientation of Ireland's active labour market policy settings. So changing how policies are delivered in terms of who is implementing activation policy in public employment services on the ground can actually change which job policies are delivered because of the kinds of different levels of experience. I mean, Nuala talked a lot about the kind of importance of frontline employment services staff having high levels of professional training, experience, competence in what they're doing, especially when they're working with longer term unemployed and highly disadvantaged job seekers. So these reforms such as marketization, they have substantive policy effects because they change who is implementing policy on the ground, the kind of worldviews that they're bringing to working with clients, working with job seekers, the kind of professional background, the occupational experience they bring. And that's something that I'm studying through. I've been doing some research which has been surveying the frontline staff delivering Ireland's mixed economy of activation. So the main programs we have at the moment is the intro service, which is predominantly targeted at the short-term unemployed, and then we have the network of local employment services, which are for people who are longer-term unemployed, heavily focused on those who are highly disadvantaged and face more kind of structural barriers to employment, and that's delivered by grassroots community-based organizations. And then we have the Job Path program, which, as I mentioned, is the predominant activation service we have in Ireland at the moment. And that's delivered by the two private agencies. So it's market delivered as opposed to community sector, third sector delivered. And these two programs are very similar in that they target very similar cohorts of clients. They're both 12-month activation programs as opposed to Jobs Club, which is kind of a short-term structured support through kind of training workshops on how to write CVs or how to prepare cover letters that people go to for short periods of time. And then we have the employability program, which is targeted for people with disability or illness. So it's quite distinct from programs that are targeted towards those who are on job seeking payments. So I've surveyed local employment services staff and Job Path staff last year. And I just want to highlight here some of the real differences that I've found so far in the terms of who is delivering these two programs at the ground level, remembering that these two programs are both targeted at broadly similar cohorts of clients. So I surveyed 112 local employment services staff and about 77 Job Path staff. And using a similar approach that a team that I was involved with before in Australia has used to survey UK employment services staff and also Australian frontline employment services staff. So this just shows what you can see here on the chart is kind of the age profile and the kind of qualification levels of those who are working at the front line of Job Path. And we can see that it's quite a young workforce. About half of them are under 45 years of age. Actually, it starts from 70% are under 45 years of age. There's not a great proportion that have a degree level qualification or above. So we can see that predominantly their highest level of qualification is either finishing the Leaving Cert or it's a non-degree qualification like a certificate or a diploma course or an apprenticeship. And then conversely, when we look at the local employment services staff, we see almost a flip. So we see very high levels of university degree qualifications and even postgraduate degree qualifications. And we see that it's a much older and more experienced workforce. I mean, 90% of the frontline staff that I surveyed in the local employment services had been working in the sector for more than 5 years, whereas that was only the case for about 10% of the Job Path staff. Now that's not that surprising because Job Path hasn't been around for that many years, but we also see very significant differences in terms of the sectors that Job Path and local employment services staff have been recruited from. That suggests that the people who are working in the Job Path program haven't been recruited from sectors where they've previously had experience of working with people who are on welfare, who are on income supports and who are looking to return to the labour market. Now, this is just to show comparative purposes in terms of the UK, and we can see that it's certainly the Irish frontline employment services workforce tends to be more educated, more highly qualified than the UK frontline employment services staff. Although in the case of Job Path, we do tend to have a younger frontline employment services workforce. There were also significant differences in the kind of levels of unionization between the two frontline workforces, and I think this is really significant. For instance, none of the Job Path staff that I surveyed were members of a trade union, whereas 2/3 of the LES staff were members of a trade union. We also know from talking to people in the industry that the job path staff tend to be lower paid than the local employment services staff as well. And as I said, the local employment services staff have had a lot more experience of working in the employment services sector compared with the job path staff. But they've also come from very different backgrounds, very different occupational backgrounds. And what you can see here is, this is the data in the survey that I ran about the kind of industry that people previously worked in before moving into the employment services sector. So we can see, I think what's interesting here is, if you look at this, of the proportion of job path staff that have come from kind of accommodation and food services, that have come from the retail sectors, that have come from the kind of financial and insurance activity sectors. I mean, these three sectors alone account for about 40% of the previous industry experience of job path frontline staff, which is quite different from the local employment services staff, who are more likely to have previously worked in more public sector orientated industries, such as health and social work. Quite a lot have worked in administrative and support services activities, and that could be as clerical officers in force, for example. So it's really important to understand here how marketization is changing who is delivering employment services with job seekers on the ground, and that's really important to bear in mind in terms of the kind of overall trajectory that activation policy is taking in Ireland. And we do tease out on this question about the kind of work first reorientation of activation policy in Ireland. We do tease out in the survey whether the frontline staff are kind of work first orientated in their approach, or do they emphasize more a focus on raising people's educational skill levels and upskilling job seekers to kind of lead to more sustained career progressions. So what this shows is, we give the survey respondents a kind of a question based on the practices in your office today. What would you say is the more important goal of your agency? It was a 7-point Likert scale. Get jobs as quickly as possible, which is emphasizing this kind of emphasis on rapid labor market attachment, or raise education or skill levels. And we can see here green is coding for this kind of emphasis on education and skill levels, and the kind of red is coding for an emphasis on get jobs as quickly as possible. We can see a much greater emphasis on work first as being the more important goal of their agency amongst the job path staff compared with the local employment services staff. But just, I should say, to put this in comparative perspective, it's not as work first orientated as the UK system, and that is important to bear in mind. And we tease this out a second way in another question, where we give the respondents a scenario. An average job seeker is offered a low skill, low paying job that would make them better off financially. If you were asked, what would you advise this job seeker to do? Would you advise them to take the job and leave welfare? Again, and it's important to highlight here, it's a low skill, low paying job, especially in the context of Ireland's low pay economy. Or would you encourage them to stay on benefits and wait for a better opportunity to come along? And you can see here again a much greater emphasis on taking the job and leaving welfare amongst the job path staff compared with the local employment services staff, who admittedly still would have place a greater emphasis on taking the job and leaving welfare, but the degree to which they work first is certainly less than the job path staff. Although again, to highlight that the context in Ireland is quite different to the UK, which is very much much more work first orientated regime, as you'd expect in a kind of liberal welfare state regime. Although we're moving in that direction, or we're moving in that path. So why is this significant, this distinction between the kind of work first orientation of the job path staff versus the human capital development orientation of the local employment services staff? I mean, maybe it's a good thing that we're seeing work first policies being implemented at the ground level as a result of marketization and as a result of the substantive policy changes that we've seen since the last crisis. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the work first policies have worked to a degree in returning people to the labour market. But I want to draw a distinction between dealing with acute unemployment that's created by a labour market crisis like the global recession versus dealing with what I would say as more chronic long-term unemployment challenges. And when we look at the data, we can see that the suite of policies that we've had since the last crisis have had an effect on, well, we can say that the activation turn, or the double activation turn, as we sort of describe it, has been associated with an overall decline in the number of people on the live register, but it's especially with a decline in the number of people on the live register among men. The decline amongst women has been far less significant, and especially among long-term unemployed claimants. I mean, in fact, just before the COVID crisis in February 2020, there were more long-term unemployed women on the live register than there were in October 2009, which is the kind of earliest we have data on this by duration on the live register and by gender. But even when we look at the kind of male long-term unemployed claimants, we see that it's the difference that our policies have made to the overall level of long-term unemployment among men on the live register hasn't been that substantial. So this tells us that this kind of work-first configuration of active labour market policy works for some people, particularly those who are already closer to the labour market, or already reasonably skilled and have been short-term unemployed, but it doesn't work for significant cohorts of claimants. And especially I want to draw attention to the current crisis, and this is kind of the motivation for that paper we wrote on kind of workfare redo, and what can we learn from the lessons of the last unemployment crisis. And what I want to highlight here is this kind of scale of the kind of pandemic unemployment crisis that we're dealing with at the moment. Now, this data is a few months old. It was from a cut of the data on the numbers of people who were on income support in the labour force an analysis that we did in the end of March 2021. And what we see in this top part of the chart is that out of a total labour force of about 2.5 million or so, we had 890,000 people almost on income support in Ireland at the end of March 2021. And that was including the people on the job seeking payments and the live register, people on the pandemic unemployment payment, and people on the wage subsidy schemes. Now, these two latter numbers have declined somewhat in recent months, but at the time of March 2021, we had 1 in 3 people in the labour force, in other words, on income support. But that's not the end of it, because in addition, we had a further 450,000 people of working age on various other kinds of income supports that aren't counted as being in the labour force, or that aren't counted as being on the live register. And this includes people on disability and carers payments, about 450,000 of those. It includes people on employment support schemes like TUS, or Community Employment Service, the Community Employment Scheme. There's about 446,000 or 47,000 or so of those. It includes lone parents. About 40,000 of those people on the one-parent family payment, and includes qualified adults. In other words, the partners of claimants, the partners of the primary claimants, who are kind of considered dependent claimants in the Irish activation system. There's about 70,000 qualified adults currently receiving income support in Ireland, and most of these 450,000 or so claimants are currently excluded from our public employment services, with the exception of Local Employment Services Network that does take in voluntary clients on a walk-in basis. But the short point of this all is that if we're to think about activation as not only about reducing the number of people on the live register, but also about a more enabling approach to activation as being about overcoming social exclusion and marginalization and disadvantage, we need to take a much wider view of the cohorts that should be involved and targeted by public employment services and by their kind of public employment services ecosystem. And it needs to include not just people on the live register, or people on the pandemic unemployment payment. I mean, the pandemic unemployment payment would be the kind of the acute unemployment cohort that I talked about previously, but it needs to include the more chronic cohorts who have been excluded from the labour market. It needs to include carers and people on disability payments. It needs to include lone parents and qualified adults. And as I've highlighted previously, the kind of work-first orientation of our activation policies last crisis didn't work for these particular cohorts. And that's why, as Nuala has been talking about, we need to move much more towards a work-life balance enabling employment approach for these kind of cohorts, which has a much greater focus on interagency collaboration and on holistic supports that combine not just job search services, but job search services with the focus on education and training and upskilling, with the focus on providing access to childcare services and supports, especially for qualified adults and lone parents, and which focuses on addressing other kind of structural challenges that people face, such as issues around housing security and issues around kind of transport barriers, especially in rural areas, that are inhibiting people from participating fully in the labour market. So that's what I wanted to highlight here in terms of thinking about a post-Reorganisation of active labour market policy, and why we need to move away from the approaches that we took after the last crisis. So I'll stop sharing there and take any questions.
So that's great, and that was a really interesting slide, and really kind of hits home about the the scale of the challenge that we may be facing into. Hopefully it's less than that. Hopefully, a lot of those industries sectors will bounce back, but it'll be slower, I think, than some of the predictions that we've had. A lot of it was low wage, precarious employment in accommodation and food. I do a lot of research on the labour market for younger people and how that interacts with the cost of living, returns to education. And there's like a report, an upcoming NERI report will just show in simple terms that we've a high level of tertiary graduates working in occupations that don't suit those skills. And it's so that brings me to, and it's the title of that paper, the high road approach. And I know the director here, Tom McDonald, as well, uses that term a lot. So that term encompasses, and myself and Nuala were discussing this last week, like when in the 50s, 60s and 70s, when say the Western world, or the UK, the US had their employment booms and all that. A lot of that was due to state involvement on the demand side, public sector jobs, right? And then the demand that creates in the wider economy will have a virtuous circle, or had. And I just guess, like, when we're discussing these things, it means we first of all, just for those employment services, we're going to need more funding, as you pointed out, which means we're going to have to find that money somewhere. And second of all, on that demand side, a say for the just transition or something like that, which is another stream of work we do in the NERI, would need a good intervention by the state in terms of resources and employment. So I guess what I'm saying is, or what I'm asking is, in the post-recovery, if we've got and we had a job vacancy rate very low for a long time, even in the good years post-financial crisis. I mean, what the other side of the equation is the demand side, and how are we going to tackle that? I mean, if we are talking about active labour market policies, we're still going to be, even at as you were saying, play with the placements and good and well trained public employment employees. If they can't match people into jobs that suit their needs because they don't exist, what's the efficacy in a high unemployment environment? And what does the high road mean in that context on the demand side? Anybody can jump in there. Or
I might just say, like, going back to the kind of 2013, 2014 time of JobBridge and the Youth Guarantee, there were a lot of very good lessons came out of those experiences that I think were kind of thrown out, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that we didn't use, that we didn't use to inform our learning on what can work. And definitely the Youth Guarantee was a very good example of a combined effort, collaborative approach with employers, with the various stakeholders, youth services, recruitment agencies, public employment services, a whole range of, and including young people themselves, designing a model that was very much about communicating what was available, what employers were looking for, what skills young people had, what was the best model and the quickest model as well. It was a 4-month guarantee. So it meant that the young person was guaranteed this kind of, very comprehensive service to look at what their skills were, to identify where they wanted to go in their careers, to try and think about what employers are saying, was available, or the types of young people that they were looking for, and even to focus in on things like transferable skills that, are the key to the future of work, or so we're told, your communication skills, how you can transfer all of those with softer skills into new roles and new approaches. So there was a lot of lessons learned from that weren't incorporated back into our public employment policies or our labour market policies. So going back to some of that, and equally so with JobBridge, some employers gave great experiences. People were able to use that on their CV. They'd got their foot in the door. It was about building social capital, but also for the person, building their human and psychological capital as well. So lots of benefits there. And I know there were some maybe rogue employers that the whole focus, the media focus on JobBridge was really, I think, the thing that brought it down in the end. But a lot of good lessons there. But it is about more collaborative approaches, more communication between what employers are looking for and the service providers and the people who are looking for work. So I don't know if that.
Well, I guess I'm just thinking about, the signs are already there with, we can't find the workers because the welfare rates are too high. Pat McDonough of Supermax, and there's been a few.
Yeah.
And so that for me, that's laying the path for blaming individuals on the unfortunate economic situations they find themselves in, that's no fault of their own, and that this it puts the onus on the individuals. We might, as you said, end up with sanctions, punitive approaches in this environment, which I find is madness. And then it kind of takes responsibility off policymakers or government in terms of what I was talking about there in the demand side. And like what also when we're saying high road in NERI as well, we're often talking about increasing taxes, and not decreasing income taxes like has come out this week. Increasing taxes on employer PSI and on other areas where we're fall behind in a kind of high income EU context, and using that then for public service employment, for funding better services like that.
I think it's that point about the benefits being too high, that rhetoric coming back. I mean, I've seen that too. I think it's really, it doesn't sound like they've learned it. I mean, they're already talking about, the pub is now, being closed off, and then they're trying to reduce it and bring it on gradually over time, and bringing it back in line with the kind of job seekers payments of the headline rate of whatever it is, 203 euros per week. And I think, it's a really important point, because what we probably haven't touched upon, which is kind of in your question there, is the kind of political economy of welfare and activation, which is kind of how all this intersects with the low pay economy in Ireland. And a workforce sanctions orientated system does kind of prop up a low pay economy, because you don't enable people to resist low paid crap jobs, particularly the younger job seekers, those under 25 who really had their benefits cut after the last crisis, and again are the kind of first people being scapegoated in relation to the pandemic unemployment payment, and they're not taking jobs at Supermax, and they're not taking jobs at Tesco's because the employment payment is set too high. I mean, our colleague Sean Irene talks about a low learnings trap, And the issue being that people who haven't had the opportunities that other people have had for education and learning, being forced early in their life into the kind of periphery of employment, the low paid, precarious employment sector, and then not being able to get ahead from there because those kinds of jobs don't actually give people any progression. I mean, there's an assumption in the government policy in the pathways to work documents that low paid, low skilled jobs can be stepping stones to kind of develop further labour market progression and career progression. But that's not borne out in the evidence really at all. And we are at risk, we haven't got there yet, of having this kind of dualised labour force in Ireland, where we have a cohort of highly skilled IT and pharmaceutical workers who are being very highly paid and in very lucrative jobs, in kind of professional managerial jobs. And then we have a growth of a low-paid, low-skilled sector workforce, and a kind of hollowing out of the middle. And the seeds of that's been happening in the past 10 years or so. And I mean, I think your own, the Nevin Institute's own research has kind of documented the issues around the rise of insecure work and temporary employment since the last crisis, and particularly the growth of involuntary temporary employment, the high proportions of people who are temporarily employed on casual or fixed term contracts because they can't get permanent employment. So when I think about a high road approach, yes, I take those points about the kind of Keynesian kind of macroeconomic policies about stimulating job growth and job demand through kind of public expenditure. And I think employer engagement is critical. But I also think of high road in terms of an emphasis on working and supporting people to enhance their employability through training, through reskilling, and through overcoming other issues around housing insecurity, around transport, that are preventing them from having access to labour market opportunities, rather than the push towards job search services immediately and pushing people into whatever jobs that are available currently at the time, which tend predominantly to be these kind of low paid, insecure work. And actually in that Workfare Redo paper, what we also try to highlight is that the very people who were kind of most affected by the pandemic unemployment crisis, and it's also highlighted in Department of Social Protection's own work on this area by papers by Dermot Coates and his colleagues, are precisely the young people in the hospitality and retail sectors. So that's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem, as opposed to kind of giving it the major surgery that's required.
Yeah, I was struck by it was both presented for Nevin the Labour Market Conference, which by the way is coming up next month for anybody who wants to look out for it. And there was Adele Whelan from the SRI was presenting in the same session on the outcomes for SICAP, and I was just struck by it's mostly temporary employment, part-time employment, low skilled, some of it in construction, but mostly not really too far away from the minimum wage, and then in and out. And so the state still has to intervene for supplementary welfare and a lot of this stuff. They're probably still in receipt of HAP, and so it's not it's not. And then how many other people could have had that job? It's and if that's the toolkit going forward, it's it's not a great environment for younger people again to be going into for the next couple of years, I'd say. Nuala?
Kieran, would it be useful to just show one slide of the actual toolkit, now that you mentioned toolkit?
Go ahead.
That the project, the collaborative approach to building public employment services has developed. And this is available. I might just share my screen and you can see where it is available. Okay, you should be able to see that now. Oh, it's all in the one screen, so it's maybe a bit overwhelming. But the idea really here is that we've developed this model of enabling employment guidance. It's a toolkit for employment services to deliver this employment guidance model towards a work-life type of a policy approach. So you can see across the top there, they're just screenshots of the different pages from the toolkit. So it's online. It tries to focus in on what is employment guidance as distinct from career guidance or educational guidance, which is very much, for most of us reminiscent of school, or maybe if you were in further education and training, or even in university, there are career guidance services, but our focus is more on, the employment side of that. So while education and training might feature, and probably will feature to some extent, it's really about sustainable employability into the future, and building your skills and developing your career and becoming, more, I suppose, helping people to get the skills to become more sustainable themselves within the labour market, which, it has to be done, I suppose, to one level, but really the public employment services need to be enabling people to access the types of supports, to get there. So we've tried to kind of detail out what all of that means. And for guidance practitioners to be able to deliver that type of model. So you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, it's quite small, but it's a kind of a poster idea of what does that model look like. So all of the different stages. So you can see from welcoming the person into the service to helping identify what types of tailored supports they might need, to doing the kind of career guidance or career exploration phase, helping people to then make a well-informed career decision. So rather than just saying, well, these are the jobs available, what types of jobs are they? Will they be meaningful for me? If I want to progress in my career, where do they lead to? So thinking more future-oriented and being a more contemporary employment service, and all of the different things that you need to consider in order to help you maybe take that risk. And it could be taking a risk off the pandemic unemployment payment. It could be taking a risk going back into employment for the first time in 10 years. It could be taking a risk on completely transforming your career and moving into a different sector. So all of the choices that we think, that we have as people maybe who've been in the labour market or attached to the labour market for a long time, what would I expect if I went to a public employment service and was getting guidance? What would I expect to get that will lead me into a sustainable career into the future? So we have, basically in this model, we have all of the resources that practitioners or services that want to implement this type of model need to think about, steps and resources to help them to do that. And at the moment, it's available on this website here at the bottom, Activation in Ireland. And it will also be available then on the INOU, the Irish National Organisation of the Unemployed, on their website, and the Irish Local Development Network website. So the resources will be there freely available for people to use into the future. So hopefully that will be of use.
Excellent. Thanks, Nuala. Well, look, I think we've covered a lot of ground there, and we have been, I think the time is upon us now, but I'd like to really thanks a million, Nuala and Michael, for your contribution here, and it's a great discussion, and one that obviously I think is going to be, there's going to be a lot of focus on in the next couple of years.